Hi, my name's Andrew Greenfield, and with my fellow Red Book authors, I'm going to take you on a tour today of Spectrum Virtualize for public cloud and the Azure cloud. And I couldn't have done it without all of these fine folks, so I want to make sure you'll see their names during the video as well, but here's the faces as well. It's truly a great collaborative effort the last 3 weeks working with them. So without further ado, let's take a look now at how to do Spectrum Virtualize in the public Azure cloud. We've also done this for the Amazon cloud. I've done a video as well as some Red Books, and there's even more technical details out there, including videos as well. Let's take a look at the architecture real quick. So the architecture is very similar, where we're using virtual machines that simulate the hardware array that you can also purchase for on-premise. Either way, it still accomplishes the same goal of volumes and snapshots and being able to replicate from on-premise or from another cloud to any other cloud using Spectrum Virtualize for public cloud software. What's so great about it is you get all the same features, all the same interface for doing nothing other than 15 minutes of deployment in a cloud system. And not only that, with our safeguarded copy, you get even more isolation, being able to remote mirror all of those safeguarded copies to any one of those clouds. Now let's take a look at this. Step one, first things first, we have to create a resource group for the Bastion service inside Azure. So once we log into Azure, we're going to simply go over and create a new resource group. And as you can see here, I already have some other resource groups, but I'm going to take you soup to nuts through it. So I'm going to create a brand new resource group. First, let's name it. In this case, because I'm going to use it for my Bastion, I'm just going to call this utility. And that way we're going to isolate this from our Spectrum Virtualize instance. And one of the main guys that I've been working with, Jackson Shea, he's a fantastic guy, so I'm going to give him credit with the first tag. Of course, tags are completely optional. I just want to make sure that everyone knows that they're just useful for metadata and finding out things. So now I've created a resource group, and as you can see, it's called utility. Now let's go to step two. We need to create at least one SSH key pair. Now, of course, you can do this on your own, but Spectrum Virtualize for PC needs at least one. And why not use the cloud service? Because that way you can actually manage and refresh them very easily. So we'll create an SSH key. So as you can see, we're going to use that brand new resource group. We're going to now name that key. And in this case, just to make it easier, because it's similar to what we're going to be using it for, the super user that we'll be using on a bunch of our virtual machines. And as before, Katja has been fantastic to work with. She is one of the sharpest Spectrum Virtualize people I've worked with in a long time. As you can see, it's validated, and now let's create that SSH key. Key point here is you'd want to make sure to download both the public and the private version of that key there. So as you can see, I've already downloaded one of them. I'm going to grab the other one right now by clicking on copy to the clipboard. And as you can see in just a few seconds here, I will then not only copy it to the clipboard, but then put this on a local text editor so that I can use it later on in the deployment. And I'd recommend you using a local text editor, something like Notepad++, or my favorite you'll see is Ultra Edit. And that way you can have multiple tabs and not have to worry about carriage return or line feeds getting in there with a standard text editor, some of the other advanced ones. So now we're on step three. Let's deploy this from the marketplace. So we're going to actually deploy Spectrum Virtualize for the Azure public cloud. So we go to marketplace. And as you can see, once we're in the marketplace, in this case right now it's a private product, but by the time you read or see this, you'll actually see this in the public marketplace. So you'll simply look for Spectrum Virtualize, click on Create, and you'll see with only a few steps, you've already created a brand new storage array in the cloud that you can start replicating to. In this case, because I'm going to use the western side of the US, they've got many different data centers. I'm just going to call this the West. So I'll pick 3. And again, for tags, metadata only. Lars has been fantastic to work with. His humor is second to none. I always click on rollback because in case something goes wrong, I want to make sure I get notified and I have a detailed log. The standard defaults work very well, but if you have a high workload or anything like that, this is where you can use more. This is a password that I've generated earlier that I'm going to use instead, but feel free to use whatever secure password you want for those virtual machine credentials. And of course, You'll use your IBM customer number. Of course, 00 won't work for you in the real world. So what you want to do is obviously use your customer number, and that's for the billing. You'll put in your email address, very easily done. And that's very important because that's going to email you the results. And back now, I'm going to need that SSH key. I'm going to paste it in there. And now I go over. The defaults for storage are just fine, and for networking as well. And same thing for the disks, but obviously this is going to be for your own particular preferences. But for the demo, I'm just using the bare minimum. And then once again, I'm going to review this. I'm going to make sure it validates. And then once it validates, I'm actually going to deploy it. And as you can see right now, the deployment's in progress. Using the upper right, the bell icon, you can actually see how the deployments or any of your deployments are in progress. And while that's going on, let's actually do a new subnet for this resource. We need this for the Bastion service. So when we need to do this, we're going to actually create a new subnet. So we're going to go inside that new resource group. And once I'm inside that resource group, I'm going to click on that VNet here. And inside this VNet is where I'm actually going to then create a brand new subnet. Now you'll see I have a Quorum subnet and a cluster subnet. And this is going to be now for my Bastion service. Now we have to use a very specific name in the Azure cloud, unlike some other clouds, where we have to name it a very specific way. That's why I'm going to zoom in a little bit so you can see it. So name it exactly like this so that it picks it up later on in the deployment process. All you have to do is click on Save, though. And as you can see, it's going to automatically give an appropriate subnet address range. That's not going to conflict with any of the other ones. Notice the name again. I'm highlighting it for you. And that lets us get to step number 5. Now I'm going to deploy that Bastion service inside the utility resource group to connect it all together. So we have that subnet. We go back over to our resource groups. We're going to click inside utility. And again, you'll see that I have the SSH key here. And now let's actually put in a Bastion. So we simply type this up. You'll see that it allows me to find that Bastion. We'll create it. And this is a service inside Azure, so it's showing up a little differently. And yes, we're going to put it inside utility. And one of the great guys who helped out with all of this, including many of the workarounds, is Stepl. So I'm going to give him credit on the happy little tag here. I'm going to put it in West US 3. The rest of the stuff doesn't matter as much, but we are going to use that default VNet and that Bastion subnet. That's very critical, and that's why I'm making sure to call it out. But once we're all set, you can actually then put on a tag. We'll give Stepl some more credit here. Again, fantastic guy. He is amazing with all of the workarounds and all the items that he found out. And again, we're going to review all this. And once it looks good, using these simple defaults, we'll simply click on deploy. And again, we'll add this to our series of deployments. You can see what's going in progress again. And how about a nice graphic? Take a look at what we've deployed so far. So you can actually see a network topology for what's going on here. So you can see the cluster, the Quorum, and the Bastion subnet, along with all those nodes and how they're connected. Now, when we go back to the west, we can actually see that deployment is still going on for our Spectrum Virtualize. So meanwhile, let's deploy a Windows VM inside that utility resource group so that we can use the GUI for Spectrum Virtualize later on. Now, I'm doing this because I'm keeping it safe versus using a public IP, but you can click on the public IP if you want. Now, notice I can choose any one of those various machines. I'm going to just use a Windows machine. Feel free to use whatever you want for a graphical user interface. In this case, I'll give myself a little bit of credit. So this is my Windows 2019 instance. And again, I'm just going to make sure it's all in the same data center. So I'm going to make sure West 3, but of course you can pick whichever one is closer to you in your groups. Now, by the way, there's a bunch of different generations. We didn't notice any difference when we were testing. We're just going to use Gen 2, but feel free to use anything you want for a virtual machine. Again, this is just for you to test out for hosts and or for using the GUI, but you don't have to use any of this. And you can see the different costs for the different sizes. And what's interesting is if you want to save costs, especially if this is only for a test purposes, is why not use a different category? And you can see that I'm switching to a different one now, which will save IBM, in this case, quite a bit of money per month. You can do the same. Once you've decided, simply click on select, and then you'll go back. And if you remember from before, we're going to use that super user password that we created earlier. I'm going to copy and paste it. And then I'm going to obviously confirm it. And again, this is where you can do some of the firewall stuff. One of the key things that we want to do is obviously enable RDP so we can get to various different things, but also enable HTTP. Now remember, we're not allowing HTTP from the public internet. This is all inside the Azure cloud still. So that 80 isn't on the public side. It's only once you've logged in using your secure Azure login. Now, by the way, if you want to save on some money, you see that you can also use your existing Windows licenses. And you can also make this faster if you want to. Instead of the SSD, I'm going to go down to the standard. I don't need the premium in this case because this isn't a performance host or anything like that. But feel free to change as you see fit. It doesn't change any of your outcomes. Now, there is something here I need you to take a look at. So we're going to use that utility, but we want to make sure that we're using a different VNet to grab that cluster subnet and then change that, you'll see in just a few seconds here, to make sure it's using the right subnet. We want to change this to the Quorum subnet. Now you can get away with a cluster if you want to do a route statement, but it's better since we want to access both of the nodes that it's on the Quorum subnet. And again, you could add more security if you want to. But in this case, I'm not going to use a public IP. We talked about that a little bit earlier. So I'm only going to be able to get to this once I log in with my Azure web login. And you'll see that later on in this demo as well. But if you wanted to make this easier for yourself and secure it, you could do a public IP to this virtual machine you're about to deploy. But the key thing here is changing the subnet and making sure to choose the right VNet or virtual network. Once you're all done, you can actually scroll down here and you can actually do more options, which will add a little bit more to your monthly Azure bill, but you don't have to check them at all. Now then, again, more options if you want in terms of monitoring and the Active Directory and identity management. You don't have to check on any of these, and more backups and disaster recovery for other different clouds in the Azure networks. So you could do that as well as those updates, but I don't have to do that. And again, you can add some more custom data and some other optional items, but you don't have to check on any of these. Last but not least, a great editor on our project, Vasfi. I wanted to make sure that he's given credit as well. He's been doing a great job wordsmithing and looking at all of our submissions over the last 3 weeks. I'm going to review everything. The validation's passed. It looks good. Again, I'm going to give my good editor-in-chief some credit here with the tags. Now we'll click on Create, and we're going to deploy it. So as you can see, we're submitting that deployment now. It's in progress. Let's go to the next step, step 7. We're nearly done. So once we're inside resource groups, I'm going to click on the West one, and now I want to do a filter here. I want to find my Quorum node. There we go. And there's the virtual machine. So if I click on him, you'll see that I can now connect to him. Take a look. It's buried a little bit on that menu bar. You click on connect, and now using my Azure web ID, I'm going to connect in through the Bastion we defined earlier. So a key point is CentOS is our username, and we're going to use that private key. And remember before, I had you save it locally, as well as if you want to copy and paste it. So take a look. Here's my private SSH key that I've saved. And if you see, then I click on connect. So now using the web login method, I'm actually going to connect to that Bastion. And there it is. I have now connected into the Bastion. And now let's do something more important with that one. Using that VM and that private SSH key, let's actually access the Spectrum Virtualize PC. So the first thing is I want to make sure that now that I'm inside my Quorum, that we update those other private keys that it's deployed so that we're all set. Now notice I click on those arrows here, and this is how I can copy and paste inside the web session to the actual Bastion host or any other host that I'm working with. So here's that private key that I'm going to copy and paste. I'm going to save it as that PEM file. And you'll see that I'm on the Quorum node down below, and I'm giving Lars credit again. You'll see that. So once I've actually saved that, you'll actually see that I need to change the permissions. And so once I've changed those permissions on over, Now let's actually try to get into the actual Spectrum Virtualize for public cloud using the command line. So we're using our Bastion right now. Here's super user at cluster, very easy for us to get in. And voila. Same thing as if you had an on-premise Spectrum Virtualize flash array. You're now logged in as the super user because of your private keys and public keys that we've put in there. And just as a proof, the command line to take a look at our system is ls system. Now I know you want to see this as a GUI. That's coming up next. Step 9. Let's use that Windows VM that I deployed to access the GUI and finish the setup. So here we go. We're going to go back into the utility. And there's my 2019. And let's take a look at it. You can see that it's running. So similar to before, let's connect in. We'll use the RDP or Bastion. Take your pick. And in this case, since I'm using the Bastion, I'm going to put in those credentials we talked about earlier. And I'm going to give you a sneak peek again. Remember, this is the password that we defined earlier. So here we are. Using the Bastion now, we are inside our virtual machine that's inside our resource group. Now, it's a default instance, so it doesn't have any really good browser. And that means it's got the old Internet Explorer, sorry, a little humor there. But I have to change the internet options so I can actually use Mozilla and actually download it. So take a look here. If you haven't done this in a long time, here's how to do it again. So it doesn't have a browser, so I need to make sure that I can put Mozilla on it or Chrome or any other your favorite browsers. I need to make sure I can do some downloads, including .NET. I might be saving some steps. So by all means, I click on yes, I click on apply. It's going to warn me a little bit, but now my IE will allow me to use Mozilla to download. You'll see that in just a second here. I'm going to go to that website that you know so very well. Grab Firefox. So here it is. We're going to grab Firefox. I'm going to save it and then run it. Just to be on the safe side, I always view my downloads before I run them. As you can see, I'm installing this. And again, we're installing this inside our virtual machine. And now that we have this, great. Mozilla is working just fine. So how do we get to it? Here's that email I told you about where it tells you all the IP addresses of all of your nodes of your Spectrum Virtualize. A simple copy and paste here from your email into your brand new virtual machine, and you'll be able to then access the GUI of the Spectrum Virtualize for public cloud. So here it is, and making sure you put your trailing slash as well. Now remember, it's got a self-signed certificate unless you want to change that, but that's part of our setup process that you can actually change it to a regular signed certificate. But here it is, as if you actually had your classic GUI, and here's using the clipboard again, where we're going to now log in. Instead of the CLI, we're now using the actual GUI itself. And I'll save this inside this browser. Now let's go through the setup. Basically, we're going to agree to some software terms. We're going to reset the password. Now, by the way, it is asking you to reset it, but you can use that secure password that you just used. This is just a safety feature to say, hey, we'd like you to change it just to be on the safe side, but I am using the same secure password I generated earlier. Now, take a look, a little trick. In case you need to see more on the screen because it's inside a virtual machine, inside a Bastion service, use the zoom like you just saw there. And you pretty much just have to just click through a few items here. I like to use for DNS, good old Google or quadruple 8, real easy to remember for a public DNS server, but you can use any DNS server you want, and obviously I'll just call it DNS1. So once that's in there, I'll set it to the time zone that I'm actually in right now so that if I look at the logs, I'll be all set. And then setting up call home, just like you would on any storage array. Hey, I'll make sure it calls home on cloud services. If you want to set up an email service inside Azure, you can do that too. We don't need to set up a proxy server, but if you want to, feel free to do that as well. It's now actually going to call home to IBM. It was all successful. And by the way, here's my IBM lab address where I actually do most of my on-premise demos. Yes, that's right, 2455 South Road in Poughkeepsie, New York. Even though I am most of the time in Phoenix, this is where I actually have a lab, so I usually use this as my address. So let me put in my postal code, and then of course you have to put in a country. You'll see that I've already pre-populated it with the machine location where I just use the same one as the Azure cloud. And I'll just rename it a little bit easier. And for context, in case something goes wrong, of course, name, email, phone, etc. And I'll paste that in. Great. It's configuring the call home right now. And also you can configure it to use Storage Insights, which is our cloud-based monitoring and reporting. We also can set up the support centers. As you can see, they're already set up. We don't need to do anything other than click through at any time versus on permission, because that would be if you were worried about remote support. So we are all set on the system setup right now. It's actually going to take that home and then restart itself. So you go to the actual main dashboard. Now, we've got a Spectrum Virtualize, and now we've got to use some of those Azure disks. So we are going to use those Azure disks that we defined earlier, and I've got to actually make them used for Spectrum Virtualize now. So the first things first, 101, for any storage arrays, I got to create a pool. Great. And in this case, because I'm using it in a cloud and I'm not too worried about I/O performance and it's going to be data reduced to help save on costs, I'm going to click on that checkbox anyway. So once that's all set as my pool, I now need to assign those disks into the pool. As you can see, they're now taking those Azure managed disks into a Spectrum Virtualize M disk, so I can now provision them to hosts or use it for replication. Don't worry about those. That's just because I'm in the process of assigning the other disk in. And of course, in real life, when you have a license, you won't have those issues as well. So I've now assigned all those to my Spectrum Virtualize pool. And as you can see, there they are, online and ready for me to provision to other hosts or for me to start using for replication. Here's the dashboard again. Notice in the upper left, it says the IBM Spectrum Virtualize for Public Cloud. The name, West SV4PC. You can see the version, 8.4.3. So you can see that it's a very up-to-date version, including our safeguarded copies, which is what a lot of our customers are using cloud Spectrum Virtualize for. So the next thing is to actually set up replication. And I'll cover this in another video, but I want to make sure you see how easy it is. So we've now set up Spectrum Virtualize in the public cloud, and in a future video, or you can take the steps yourself, you can easily set up your own VPN to start your own replication. By all means, please, if you have any questions, don't hesitate. Please reach out. I look forward to seeing you and hopefully talking to you soon. Thanks again for watching and for being a great IBM customer.